Hello and welcome to this episode of the Hello Firstname podcast, Season 2. My name is Rasmus Hårlin, author of the book Hello Firstname, and the theme of this season is how to solve the content crisis for personalization. Let's dive in. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Hello Firstname podcast. The theme of this season is how to solve the content crisis in personalization. Because I believe that solving the content crisis is actually what stands between us finally being able to scale personalization in the way we marketers have always wanted. Once we're done solving the data crisis, which is real enough, I'm not arguing that, the content crisis suddenly becomes very real because we need something to tell these perfect audiences or segments that we build. How to manage that content and how to make it scale. Second thing that now stands clear to, I think, most marketers is that Gen AI has become really, really big and for good reason. So the big questions are then, so how does the content layer look when we zoom in on that? Right from the birth of master content into having one-to-one personalized execution content for each customer. And subsequently, how can Gen AI help us in making the content pipeline flow more efficiently? What are the do's, don'ts? What are the top use cases, the top tools? Who's already doing it? So that's what this season is all about. So I hope that you'll listen to this episode, that you'll enjoy it, and you'll also keep an eye and an ear on the upcoming episodes. So in the studio to discuss this today, I've invited Nicole France from the headless CMS company Contentful to help us discuss content in a broad form and discuss the content pipeline. And Nicole, you work as a chief evangelist, and you are an expert within the use of content in all its forms. Those are my words. But I couldn't really think of anyone better to discuss this with. So good to see you here on the show. Welcome.
Great. Thanks, Rasmus. It's great to be here. One of my favorite topics. So I definitely would not describe myself the same way.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think now's your chance, actually, because I mean, I've obviously been checking out your background, and you have actually quite a long background. I'm almost a bit envious on your thought leadership sort of track record. Been working with Fujitsu, Gartner, G2, Cisco, and in the last sort of 3-4 years in Contentful. So, but yeah, let's hear it in your own words. Actually, how would you describe your career? And then
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the thought leadership thread is the strong one. And I started my career somewhat accidentally as an analyst, working at a small firm that got acquired by Gartner not long after that. So I spent about the first decade of my professional life as an analyst. And I guess old habits die hard, because I think I've taken a lot of what I learned from that and I've applied that in a variety of different roles. And in fact, gone back and forth to being an analyst a few times along the way. But it really is a question of critical thinking, for one, good observational skills, and really trying to take all this information and synthesize it into something that helps us understand what's going on and figure out how to take action. And that has been the consistent thread. I've kind of moved across several different companies and slightly different parts of the technology industry, and certainly across a variety of different subjects. But the common thread has always been customers. How do we really engage our customers effectively in a way that is mutually beneficial? Because I think that's the foundation of a healthy business. You know, you can talk about sales and revenue and profit, and these things are very important numbers for the health of a business. But the other really important statistic is customer lifetime value, because that's what tells you if you have a customer base that finds you valuable enough to keep coming back. And we also know, as good marketers, that it's way less expensive to sell to someone you've already sold to before than to go out and find new customers.
Definitely. Yeah. So the thought leadership being a part of it, I like that. I mean, I guess my title here at Agilic could be chief evangelist, because indeed I even wrote my own evangelist.
I know, so you're ahead of me. So really, Rasmus, you should.
And highly recommend obviously reading the book, but also writing your own if you're into that. So, and also I guess the reports that you've also been part of, being an analyst, it's really makes you sort of when we need to convey a topic to someone else that demands quite a high degree of understanding with it. But a chief
Yeah.
evangelist, that's your title. What does a chief evangelist do? Maybe already in part answered that, but
Yeah, nothing to do with Pat Roberts, but no, the idea really is this. We have a whole lot of people across this organization that know our product extremely well. I know it pretty well too.
Yeah.
And they are great at talking about the product and evangelizing the product. One of the interesting challenges that we found as the company has grown and evolved is our original focus was selling to primarily development teams because they were the ones who had the real challenges with getting content that was locked in these web content management systems and making it portable across any digital channel. So imagine
Yeah.
you're building mobile apps, or even you're building video games, or you're trying to really quickly to easily use content, across digital signage, across social media. I mean, this was the really big challenge that our founders initially designed for. And what's interesting is that as business has evolved, as digital transformation has become more and more extensive, what we've realized is that we're not just serving, it's not like this is a new realization, by the way. We're not just serving the needs of the engineering teams, the digital product teams that are creating these digital products. We're very much supporting the needs of marketers and content teams, the people who are conceptualizing and creating this content and working with it.
Yeah.
So my job, I sort of half jokingly refer to as more of a problem evangelist than a product evangelist,
Yeah.
because,
Yeah.
as you say, you
I
talk
can
about
relate to
content
that.
chaos. We talk about friction. I mean, part of the challenge is the term content means kind of everything and nothing at the same
Yeah.
time, but
Oh,
that's
yes.
that's a whole other podcast, Rasmus. So we can
Yeah.
save that one for later.
I
But
think we'll touch upon it later, but let's not, we might
yeah,
not like
exactly.
touch everything about it.
But the challenge is really myriad. I mean, companies and teams face so many issues, so much friction. Content is arguably one of the biggest areas of investment that a company makes that it can't actually put a number to because it's so fragmented, right?
Yeah.
And so what I spend an awful lot of my time doing is, giving talks, engaging with our customers, working with our partners, really trying to help frame the problem. Because, the first step to solving a problem is, number one, acknowledging you have one. And it's a lot easier to acknowledge it if you can help to frame it and put some
Oh, yes.
vocabulary around it.
Yeah.
Right. So that's what I really spend a lot of my time doing. It's understanding the challenge of why digital content, what are we doing with this anyway?
Yeah.
Why do we invest so much in it? Why do we care?
Yeah.
What are we ultimately trying to do?
That makes total sense. So at least what I've found as well is that, in order to convey something meaningful and to come up with a solution, you need to spend a lot of time with the problem. And I mean, especially we're talking about existing clients, and clients already know your solution. So, but they're still stuck in the problems. So really talking about the problems, that's where you meet clients. Because that's where they are. They're still struggling with these problems where your product might be part of the solution, but it's probably not all of the solution, because there's a lot of, there's always people, process, and technology is only one third of that equation.
Well, it reminds me of, I think, the best guidance I ever heard, and I can't remember who originated this, but they deserve a whole bunch of credit, is the best way to tackle any of this is to be in love with the problem you're trying to solve, and not your solution. And I think that's as true whether you are, someone in the business, in the mix that's trying to sort it out, or a technology vendor, or anybody else that's trying to present a solution, because the problem itself is often evolving. And I think that's a very fair assessment of how we talk about content today.
And let's spend just maybe like 30 seconds, 1 minute on the solution, because I think maybe not all of our listeners would be familiar with the term headless content management, or the brand Contentful for that matter. Let's just say a few words about that. I think that would be
what it is.
helpful.
Yes. Happy to. So Contentful is a content management platform. We talk about headless, and it's this kind of weird term that I think finally people in marketing have actually heard of. It's taken about a decade, but the idea fundamentally is this. As I mentioned earlier, the challenge with traditional content management systems is that they are very much web content management systems. but we're doing things across all of these digital channels in so many different ways, in so many different places, that it was very clear to our founders, Sasha and Paolo, that we needed a way to get this content, to manage it independently of the channels where we use and present it. And so that means headless, right? So you have the body of the content, but it's agnostic as to where it's going to go in digital channels. So it doesn't have the head, right? And that means a couple of things. One is that you have to work in structured content. The only way this makes sense is if you define really effective content models, because you still need a mental model for understanding what that content looks like and how it goes together.
Yeah.
The beauty of that is that it's highly composable as a result. So modular, atomic, use whatever adjective you want to here. The beauty is that you can create content models where you have various different kinds of content types that might be different sizes and scales. It might be a hero banner. It might be the elements of a hero banner. You have various things that come together to create long form content. It's really highly flexible. So that is a crucial point of this approach. And the second is that the technology architecture itself is all API based. And what that means is that all of this content is readily accessible. You can easily pull it anywhere that you want to use it. And importantly, you can actually use it as building blocks. So you can dynamically compose whatever kind of content, whatever endpoint you want to present it through this combination of APIs and structured content.
Yeah. Okay. I think that works for me at least. Thanks for clarifying that. It almost answers, or at least in part, actually my next question, which is, I sent you before this session that we're now having, I sent you what I've decided to call sort of the content crisis manifesto. I briefly touched upon it in sort of the intro here, that I believe that in order for us to actually make personalization scale for real, then once we're done sort of tackling the data crisis, if you like, and we've got all our insights readily accessible in a CDP or wherever we get it from, then content is next, because eventually, if you don't show any content to anyone, there is no personalization. It's just a lot of insights, and that's very fine, Mr. Wizard in your ivory tower.
You're going to have great audience segments, but if you don't know what matters to them and what you're going to say to them, so what?
Or if you say it in a rude way or in an insultive way, or if you step over people's boundaries. There's so many ways that it can go wrong, but they all require content. And I believe that sort of, especially the message part is, what your calls to action or next best actions or next best experiences, especially those. Those need to be managed centrally in much the same way as sort of the data from a CDP. Anyway, I'm talking about, in the content crisis manifesto, talking about this content layer, which is almost sort of a reflection or a parallel to the data layer. How does the sort of architecture of Contentful align with or support this concept? Does that make sense to you at all?
Yeah, it definitely does. And it's actually probably very closely aligned with how we think about content. So we talk about things like content orchestration. Again, I think one of the challenges of working in this space is we really don't have a very well-defined, consistently used vocabulary around this stuff.
Yeah.
Orchestration is a broad term. You can use it in a bunch of different ways.
I was about to ask what you think when you say the word
yeah, exactly. That could be a whole podcast episode in itself.
Yeah.
But when we talk about things like orchestration, that can be widely applied to a number of different areas. When we talk about content orchestration at Contentful, what we're really talking about is the ability to bring content into a coherent structure and work with it, manipulate it, combine it, track it, understand it. Things like, do you have out of date content that needs to be updated? All of these kinds of things, all of the various analysis that you would want to do, not just of the production, but also potentially of the use of that content. But how do you bring it together? How do you organize it? How do you understand what you have? How do you readily make use of it wherever you want to send it? And when I say things like that, let me maybe give a specific example that helps to solidify that. think of a fast food restaurant, a quick serve restaurant. They have a website, they have mobile apps. Increasingly, a lot of them actually sell a tremendous amount of their volume through mobile apps. They have kiosks in the stores, in the drive-throughs. They have digital signage, which are the menu boards up, right? And that's before we get to any of the advertising and the social media and all of these other things, right? All of these things require digital content. And think about managing menu items. Think about managing the imagery for those menu items.
Yeah.
What has classically happened is things like the
Yeah.
menu board are actually like one static file.
Yeah.
So imagine you're going to change the ingredients of a menu item, or you're going to add a special item in. It becomes incredibly complicated and challenging to change that in all of these different places, right? So what Contentful has been focused on since the beginning is, how do you solve that problem? How do you manage that in one place? And how do you also recognize that there may be things that you're pulling from other systems? So part of the reality here is we live in a heterogeneous world. Anybody who is making technology investments knows that. We're trying to design for that reality. So while you can manage all of your content in Contentful, and we certainly are very happy for that, there are always going to be other systems that need to run alongside that. Often it's DAMs, for example, or PIMs, but it might be ERP systems. It might be CRM systems. It might be other CMSs that you have very good reason to keep, right? And so part of the challenge is exactly, how do you have one place where you can actually manage and make sense of all of these sources of content in a way that allows you to effectively use them wherever you want to use them. So when we talk about content orchestration, that is a big part of it. I mean, there's obviously a lot of other issues and challenges that go into that. But it's even things like, how do you size an image so that it's appropriate for whatever channel you're sending it to, and you don't have to do that manually.
And here we're not even talking about personalization. I mean, this sounds like the content crisis is not only in personalization. The content crisis is definitely also something that comes before that. So if we have sort of the content pipeline where getting all your, I call it master content, by the way. So all the master content that you basically don't personalize, but you might localize, that you get that into one place and you can sort of pull that out from within the content layer for whatever sort of platform where you want to serve it.
Exactly. Well, and you touched on something that is really about managing variance as well, which is like the gateway drug to personalization in a sense. So, whether it's variance for A/B testing, or whether it's localized variance, whether it's translations, I mean, you may have variance for different contexts, so like Staples Canada is a customer that has some fairly straightforward, you could call it personalization. It's really segmentation. Are you a business customer, or are you an individual customer? You're going to get different things, and because you're a different style of customer, and so there's a different type of engagement. So you can begin to see where this is kind of the foundational principle, if you will, of how you want to do anything that is more dynamically or individually.
So in writing the book Hello Firstname, my co-authors and I, we came to a point where we decided to call all types of personalization for personalization. So even though it was rather vague or weak or not very super hyper personalized, then we'd still call it personalization because people were getting their invoices paid where it said personalization on them. So the whole point about deciding too much or spending too much time deciding whether someone was really kosher personalization, doing kosher personalization or not, that really didn't bring us any value. It was more a question of, okay, so how personalized is it? Because you can hardly do any personalization or do any marketing without it being just a little bit personalized. Even though, I mean, or look at it this way, even just say that you have a completely static website. The people who come to the website will come there for different reasons, and there will be some potential customers that for some reason cannot just make it to the website. And that's already sort of, okay, so that means that you are talking to a specific segment that has a laptop, or if you're on the mobile, then someone who can afford a mobile.
Who's on Pinterest? Who's on Instagram? Who's on?
Exactly.
Who's
it's
on
already
Snapchat?
A segment. Yeah. And I think we came out to the conclusion that even filtering people out, excluding them from communications, that's also an act of personalization, even though that they'd obviously never noticed this.
Oh, I mean, this was, when you're dealing with C-level executives, this was one of the challenges that my team and I had at Cisco. You definitely do not want to be spamming the inbox of a CEO of a Fortune 500 company. Ways to probably not even piss off the CEO, but piss off all of his or her admin team, because they're the ones doing that filtering.
Exactly. Yeah. So definitely, I mean, that whatever customer experience is different from the general one, where you don't say everything to everybody all the time, that's a personalized customer experience. And even pretty static content can be part of that. So you have a perfectly static landing page on your website, which is built for a specific segment, and it's not personalized at all. There's nothing dynamic about it. It can still be part of a personalized customer experience, because you decide who to send there. So, all right. So going back to sort of the more framed questions that we have, sort of getting off on a drift there, but it's enjoy the conversation. So let's take it as a sign of that. So in your experience, how are marketers currently struggling with the content crisis, especially when it comes to personalization? How do you see that?
I think the perennial content challenge is always volume. It's the volume of content and the competing expectations for how much a content organization or a marketing organization will create versus how high quality or how effective it is. And I think this is to me kind of the crux of the challenge here.
So creating enough content, quality content.
Yes, but also not creating too much, because this is the other thing that happens. We know there is a ton of stuff out there that essentially has no audience. So why are we bothering?
Yeah.
Right. And yet there are a whole lot of reasons, some good and some bad, where a lot of organizations just don't actually make that assessment and make that call. And then the challenge becomes that you have typically a fairly small number of people who really have great ideas, who understand what it is that's going to land and resonate with an audience. And they're often kind of struggling to keep the right plates spinning, because they're being asked to do so much more than the stuff that actually really matters. And I think part of the challenge is being able to identify what really matters.
Yeah.
And again, going back to audience segments, that's an incredibly challenging thing, because volume is not the only measure of that.
Yeah, I mean, the value of a segment could be completely sort of juxtaposed to how big the segment is, at least.
And often you will have a very okay. So let me give an example. Neiman Marcus is historically very high end department store in the United States, and its entire history has been built about being exclusive and being the tastemakers, being the style
trendsetters,
determinants, if you want, right? Like they're the ones that are actually helping to create what the style trends are. You can imagine in an audience like that, you have a small number of incredibly high value customers.
Yeah.
Right? And how you're going to engage with that audience, and you might not even consider that one audience. The way you're going to engage with those people is going to be very, very different than someone who is maybe an aspirational customer who makes a very occasional purchase. And the volume of revenue, the profitability associated with that, these are very different dynamics, and small number of high value customers versus long tail of, frankly, lower value customers, you're going to take different strategies and approaches here.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. I always wondered why the sort of buying experience, the shopping experience for a business class plane ticket is exactly the same as a sort of coach plane ticket. I would expect a bit more fireworks when I'm paying, I don't know, $7,000 for a ticket to Australia, as opposed to I don't know, a fifth of that. So
and it's interesting, right? Because they know who you are. Often you're signed in when you go to make these purchases. Yeah.
And I think in general, people's expectations towards this are getting bigger. So if I find myself having to sort of repeat something that I believe that the brand I'm dealing with should already be knowing and should be taking into account, then I tend to actually get a bit offended, or at least I'm feeling less valued, and that's totally not the feeling that you want to convey to your high end customers.
No. I mean, and it's like we've all been through the IVR loop where you go through the automated system and you give all your details, and then you finally get to the human and you have to give them all again. It's like, literally, why did you make me do this the first time?
Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
Or if you, I don't know, in Denmark, you can punch in your personal identification number before. I mean, if you are in line on the phone, and if then the first thing they ask is who are you, then I'm just
you just
that's
lost.
just
You just
not
lost
where you want to start the
credibility. Well, and
conversation.
yet it's interesting too, because if you think about this in, I'm just going to use a retail context because this is one that's easy to relate to.
Everybody raised it, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I shop for myself. I shop for my other half. I might shop for other people in my family. You know, what kind of promotions do you send me? And it sometimes is a lot more complicated than that. I mean, you know, retailers know about something called householding.
Yeah.
And yet we don't necessarily think of that so much when we talk about personalization, typically in a lot of other contexts. But there are certainly a whole lot of variables that are easy to get wrong.
Yeah.
I think that's part of the challenge too.
Yeah, and part of it is also, I mean, not assuming too much from what you know. So we distinguish between the term explicit and implicit personalization. And if you're not dead sure about something, then doing explicit personalization about it can be, I mean, because you bought this, then you probably also like this. Well, it may totally not be the case. Yeah, I recently met a guy from Love Honey. I don't know if you're familiar with them. It's a UK brand. They're selling, for instance, sex toys. So the wrong recommendation can, genuinely and literally put people off.
Yes.
So that really puts sort of personalization on its edge.
Well, it's interesting because if you think about how we do this in a face-to-face context, and I think fundamentally what we are still trying to do is get as good at doing this in digital channels as we are in a face-to-face.
Yes. Yeah.
You know, as
would it feel weird in the real world? Then don't do it digitally.
Exactly. Well, and the interesting thing is, like, this is what we do, and we might not even be consciously aware of it. We make assumptions. And good shop associates are very good at making assumptions as soon as you walk through the door, even if they've never met you. But part of what makes them good is that they test those assumptions.
Yeah.
So they don't assume that they're right.
Exactly. Yeah. They don't say you're going to need this unless they're really sure, right?
Yeah, and they're testing, right? You know, they're giving you options, they're asking questions, they're doing the things that help to validate whether their assumptions are right or not.
Actually, recommendations.
Yeah.
All right. So the content crisis, I mean, to put it short, is very much about having all these variants in place that we mentioned. And what I understood from you is that one of the key things that you're addressing with Contentful is all the different variants that you'd be needing for surfacing, actually not necessarily highly personalized, but to some extent localized content across any channel where it could sort of appear or be served. When we think more about the content crisis for personalization in this case, is that equally big for, if you're working with inbound channels versus outbound channels? Is that the same beast we're trying to tackle? How do you see that?
I think the short answer is yes. And there are different ways of approaching this. So if we think about inbound as somebody coming to any of our digital channels through whatever
could
means,
be website, right? Your app.
Exactly. It could be your app. It could even be your advertisements, right? In whatever. Look at that. See, exciting advertising. But in whatever channels those are in, or whatever digital platforms those are in, then what we're really trying to do is something that is to some degree anticipatory, and part of that has to do with, like, if you're advertising or posting in Threads, you're probably going to have a different style and tone of voice than you might in Instagram or in TikTok, right? Not just different formats. But it's also about how we can
channel
identify
dependent
quickly
tone of voice and
a channel
style.
tone of voice, exactly, the style of thing. But what do we know about the audience that's there? What do we know about the audience's expectations in those channels? And you might have the same person across multiple channels. They probably still are going to have different expectations in those distinct channels because they're looking for something different. They're there for different reasons often. But part of what we're trying to do with the inbound is be very responsive. We're trying to identify clear patterns and behaviors, and it's not just about retargeting data. Sometimes we know. Sometimes these are people who we already know, and maybe we have a first party cookie, or maybe they're signed in. We know something about them, so we can immediately shift what we're presenting to them based on what we know. We can also try to do this even if we don't know who they are. Partly it is that contextual channel kind of stuff. Partly it's also kind of, phishing in a sense. What do you put out? How do people respond? This tells you something. And if you are asking the right things or making the right assumptions and testing them, you can really adapt in some very interesting ways as a result.
Yeah, true.
On the outbound side, I think this is where it gets super interesting because on one hand,
that would be emails, push notifications,
exactly,
direct mail, or I don't know, text messages,
all
even
kinds of things.
WhatsApp.
And again, actually, advertising is part of this as well. What are the things that you're pushing out to the wider world where you maybe don't have as high a degree of refinement over what type of audience is seeing it? But you want to, right? Like this is part of what good advertising does. I think there's a combination of being contextually specific about that too. If you're communicating, let's say you're an airline and I know, Rasmus, that you're interested in business class tickets to Australia and you have a certain expectation for what that experience is going to be like, that purchase experience. I can send something to you that's very tailored based on what I know about your behavior patterns. And they might or might not be super recent, right? I think there's another aspect of this, though, which is a little bit different to what we're talking about here in terms of managing variance. And it is about storytelling. Because I think one of the things that matters most about personalization is not so much what we think we're doing or delivering, but what it feels like on the receiving end.
Yes.
What does that mean to the recipient? How do they take it? And experience is by definition subjective, right? So we can never completely control that, but we can get really good at stacking the deck in favor of what we would like that experience to be.
We become better at guessing and suggesting.
Yeah, well, and understanding, right? There's a level here of understanding, which is the qualitative aspect of knowing our audiences, in addition to the quantitative patterns that we have. But there's another element here, which I think we tend not to talk about in this story of personalization, and that is how we can tell the kinds of stories that are universal, but that feel tremendously personal. They resonate with individuals, right? And I think if we're really going to think about personalization in the widest and most effective sense, we need to understand these two different aspects, because there's a lot that we can and should do better that is contextual, that is responding to what we know about an individual, particularly if we already have a relationship with them. But we can actually do a really good job of building those kinds of emotional connections that feel deeply personal. And that is a slightly different thing, but it's an equally important piece of the puzzle.
I totally agree. So if I can paraphrase here. So you're basically, what I hear you saying is that personalization is one thing, and we can and we should do that. But in order for things to be perceived as personal, that's actually something else. That's something, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and so is relevance. And so is, the customer journey the customer has the customer journey. And we can try whatever we do to personalize our offering towards the recipients, but they are the judges of what is actually being perceived as personal. And that doesn't necessarily have to be super personalized, which is ironical.
No, it's true. It's true.
Good at your storytelling, and that can resonate with people's feelings.
It's interesting because
be all you need.
And I think it's the combination of these things, right? When we get the combination right, that's what's incredibly powerful.
Exactly.
But I think it's fair to say that in a lot of cases, when we talk about, in air quotes here, personalization, what we're really talking about is targeting.
Yeah.
And think about how that, like, what does that inspire in you when you hear that word? That feels very different.
Yeah, I feel like a target. Yeah.
Right?
I'd still regard it as an act of personalization, not the one that gives me the most personal experience. But, from a marketer point of view, I just see people getting paid for doing targeting, and they're calling it personalization. And, us bickering amongst ourselves as marketers saying that's not kosher personalization. Just really trying to steer clear of that.
Well,
So
and this is your point. It doesn't really matter. Like, we can split hairs all we want to. What matters is how effective is it?
exactly, how
And how
personal
does it produce the kind of experiences and connections and feelings on the receiving end that we really want, number one, and that number two are actually in support of a long-term healthy business.
Let's go back to the to sort of the to the script basically. So in the Content Crisis Manifesto, so we distinguish between what I would call master content and execution content. And with master content typically being what you have as as the backbone of your website, your app, and the execution content being the messages. So like in the old personalization sort of equation, the right message to the right person. So this would be the messages that would be there. That's also the term that we use in the bow tie of personalization, which is the model here in the book, Hello Firstname. So master content, backbone, website, app, articles, product feeds, whatever. Execution content, your messages, your calls to action, your calls to experience. The key messages that you would actually maybe even send to customers in order to nudge them further along the customer journey. Does that distinction, make sense for you?
It does. I would probably come at it slightly differently, but I like the way that you frame that. I think I would even step back from what gets displayed where with the master content, because arguably what's on your website is the executional content, especially if you're doing something dynamic, right? But what you really have in the master content is, you're right, the things, the messages, the ideas, the understanding of the audiences and what matters to them. I mean, this to me, and my little mental model is like the plasma ball of electricity. When you have this, you can turn it into anything.
So the one where you put your fingers on it and then you see the spark
Which,
come
like,
to your
some weird
fingertip.
Nikolai Tesla kind of image comes to mind. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think, you're right. These are the fundamental elements that allow you to do anything else, whether it's static or dynamic, as you say, right? So you have to have this understanding. I mean, back to, you can have great audience segments, but if you don't have the message, so what? It's the same thing. You have to have, as a business, as an organization, you have to understand the things that you want to talk about. And probably your products and offerings are a big part of that. But
I hope.
most successful marketers will tell you that you want to have something else beyond that too, right?
Yeah.
What matters? Like, what is your mission in the world? Why should people care? Why your stuff and not someone else's stuff? And how do you do that? Do you do that with a sense of seriousness and purpose? Do you do that with a sense of humor? I mean, all of these are essential building blocks. So I think where I think we're getting to, especially in this world where generative AI has such an important role to play, and it really is kind of part of this iteration process. When we talk about things like dynamic personalization, I think what we're talking about is having all of these foundational resources, the foundation content, right? The master content is actually the ideas of like what you want to get across to whom, right?
Yeah.
What is the substance?
Exactly.
What is the tone? What is the CTA, right? What is the CTA in a certain context? But maybe even that is a little bit fluid, because where I think we're increasingly getting to is with good personalization, understanding what is the type of interaction or what is the type of conversation, if you will, that we want to be having with a particular audience segment. And honestly, part of that thinking needs to be, why do they care? What's in it for them? What matters to them? And when we have all of this stuff, then we can do some really, really cool stuff.
Yeah. So let me try and make it a bit more precise. So the sort of the distinction, sort of the original idea with that was basically that master content would be the content that you don't personalize. So I haven't yet seen anyone personalizing like the product descriptions, for instance. So
I have an example of that.
and I think you could do maybe an outbound communication. So you could, sell me this pen style. There could be definitely, and I've seen also that working in, for instance, abandoned basket emails, where Gen AI is actually doing. We have a client here at Agilic that is doing that actually, where they're doing completely individualized Gen AI descriptions for the abandoned basket email, where they're talking about why these, I don't know, pink pair of Birkenstock sandals would be the perfect fit for you.
Yeah.
And that is kind of unique, but I would still be a bit, I don't know, freaked out, or I have yet to see that I go onto a website and then the product is being sort of presented
All
to
right.
me in a
I'm
personalized.
going to give you an example that I
Great.
hope is thought provoking, because I find
Yeah.
this one fascinating. Okay.
Yeah. Hit me.
So Ruggable is a customer of ours. I am also a Ruggable customer. I'm sitting on top of a Ruggable rug right now in my
Yeah.
office. They have done what I think is absolutely genius in some of their approaches to personalization. So let me give you the mind-blowing example, and then I'll put it into some broader context too. So one of the things that they have recently released is a design assistant, and it's using multiple forms of AI. So what it's asking you to do is upload a photo of the room that you're shopping for.
Yeah.
And it's using image recognition. It's identifying the color palettes. It's identifying a design style. Side note, I don't know how they deal with people that don't have a discernible design style, and I'm guessing that's probably a lot of people. So
They
there's a
frame
whole
it.
other level of genius in
Yeah.
there that I don't know anything about, but impressive anyway. So what it does is then it gives you a list of suggested rugs, right? But what they're doing is they're very subtly adjusting the description of those products to incorporate the color palette that they've identified. So, what kind of color hues and tones, and also your design style.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's very, very subtle, but it is, in my mind, the kind of thing that's likely to be very effective, because these are exactly the things that you as the customer are primed to respond to, right? You know, and it's, I think the fact that it's subtle is, again, a huge point in its favor, because it's not trying to go too far.
So
It's
would
not
that
trying to be
be
super invasive.
would that be sort of the recommendation that you get to after you've been through this process? Then there's, or
You
would
upload the
that be
photo.
like looking at any product after having been through that?
That I don't know. That I don't know, and I will ask them about. But I will say this:
It's brilliant nonetheless.
isn't it? I think so too.
Totally.
But one of the things that has really struck me for a long time about the way that Ruggable approaches personalization is that they are keeping it elegantly simple.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is, they do a bunch of designer collaborations. So it's like, okay, are you into their designer collabs? Are there specific designers that you're interested in? But the other really big thing is, the whole point of Ruggable is that they're rugs that you can wash in your washing machine.
Yeah.
Very appealing for families with young children, particularly also pet owners. And one of the things they also know is that cat people are not necessarily dog people, and dog people are not necessarily cat people.
Typically
So
not.
one of the biggest points of personalization is actually, are you a pet owner, and what kind of pet owner are you?
Yeah.
And again, like, they do this in some very subtle ways, but I think it's amazing. And they have absolutely seen the uplift in conversions and click-throughs and all kinds of metrics to
That's
prove
very
that
subtle
this
way
is
to do it.
working.
Yeah. I like that example. Yeah. And I think the sort of this example is really putting the sort of distinction on the edge, because I like to see execution content as where you personalize it, where regardless of whether that is outbound or inbound. So the result of a recommendation like that, I would definitely regard that as execution content, where sort of the standard how-to article or do-it-yourself article, even a landing page that's designed for a specific segment, I would probably call that master content as well. As your about us pages would be, or your case studies, or so those might be translated and localized, but they're probably this. I mean, basically, it's the same piece of content. Whereas as soon as you start, I know you have different calls to action and different sort of stuff that you'd ever like a customer to. I mean, that you could ever think about asking a customer to do, or update my profile or download your app, and whatever sort of argumentation that comes with that would then be different from segment to segment, or even from individual to individual.
Yeah.
And that's sort of where we see, that's what we call the execution content, which brings it closer to, so there's a part of like serving the best average experience for everybody, which is also where CRO really lends itself. So you're
Yep.
optimizing and you're testing and you're definitely matching some insights together with some content, but it's still with the aim of sort of finding the best common denominator in terms of how does our static website look. And then at some point you say, okay, wow, now our CRO efforts, they're actually not paying as much off as they used to. Well, maybe that's because we are, I mean, if not done, then we need to take our CRO efforts into personalization efforts, really, which essentially is the same process, but you'd probably apply it not only to the website, but also to your outbound communications as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's a mix, right? And I think part of this is the big question in my mind. It's clear that this stuff works when you get it right. Having said that, I think there's still a tremendous amount that doesn't work because we haven't gotten it right collectively.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Example?
I'm just going to come right out and say it. Amazon is always held up as this great paragon of personalization. I can't tell you how many really shitty recommendations I've gotten from Amazon.
Yeah.
And it kind of mind-blowingly bad. Like, no, I'm not interested in that. Why on earth would you think that I am? So maybe unfair, but I
was doing a workshop the other day with one of our implementation partners, Merkel, here in Denmark, and my counterpart at the workshop, my sort of co-host, she had this example of Amazon. It was actually a review by someone who had been extremely annoyed by Amazon, continuously trying to sell her toilet seats, and I think the review was something like, "I'm not collecting toilet seats. This is not some sick fantasy of me. No matter how many variants or whatever you're trying to show me and send me, and how cheap it is, I don't want another toilet seat.
Yeah,
please
stop showing me this. It is pretty remarkable, and I think it's interesting where if you go to something like Netflix or Spotify, you can do the things that say like, no, I don't want like this. Like, hate this song.
Negative
hate
feedback.
This song specifically, or like don't want anything more like this. These are really powerful and important signals that, again,
feedback mechanisms.
The feedback mechanism is key. But the other thing that really strikes me about this stuff is, we know if we look at social media, these like massive echo chambers that have emerged because the sort of dopamine hit is like the outrage button. So keep showing me things that I find outrageous or whatever, right? And what I wonder is if we risk doing something similar with personalization, because I think fundamentally what we also as humans find deeply engaging and satisfying is feeling like we're part of a community. Yeah. So yes, I want you to understand me as an individual, but I don't want to feel like I'm alone. I don't want to feel like I'm isolated. No. I want to feel like I'm part of a group. And so
I wonder whether retailers are ever in danger of sort of doing that, because, I mean, after all, it's not a huge part of our life, the interactions we have with retailer X. So, but I see from a social media point of view, definitely. And I also do get scared about that, because you see like communities getting more and more rabid, basically.
Yeah.
And that's a scary effect, and which is also an act of personalization, sort of the echo chamber effect. I saw the funny thing is, I mean, if you're looking at it from sort of a customer engagement point of view, I saw a talk done by a woman from Spotify, and she'd been experimenting with how much a song should resemble something that you already like, and sort of where's the balance between giving you something that you probably like and something that will sort of
something different.
Yeah. And I think with product recommendations, you can probably do a mix, and you can sort of do like present multiple shelves and say, this is because you watched X, or this is because you listened to X, or this is based on your 10 top listened tracks or whatever. And there could be one say, we're not quite sure about these songs, but
we think this is cool, so we just thought we'd send it your way.
Or give it sort of maybe a bit watered down headline saying you might also like, I mean, but you might not.
But this is interesting, and I think again, this is one of the really big questions as generative AI becomes more and more an integral part of our lives and the way we work, because it's by definition derivative.
Yeah,
and that's not a value judgment. That is a statement of fact, right? you can go to Claude and have it create a short film in the style of Wes Anderson if you want it to, right? Or an image. And you can do that because there is a Wes Anderson who has already created a Wes Anderson style, right? So what happens next? Like, you need the ghost in the machine, you know, like you need the new things that are coming in.
Exactly.
And I think that is fundamentally going to be human creativity, right? I mean, by the way, humans also super capable of doing derivative and often not very good derivative work. So I'm not like slating generative AI here by any means.
Oh, no.
But you know, like it's that interaction, it's that combination. And I think part of what is fascinating in how we think about using generative AI to do personalization, particularly, is how do we lean into that, creating all of the stuff, all of the variants, but the right variants, you know, like how are we giving it the appropriate framing and guidance, the right inputs, and also understanding, you know, what is the degree of output that we want.
So basically, if I can paraphrase, we still need to generate sort of the original ideas in the content and put them on a string, but then sort of the repurposing thing, that's what we could probably get help with from AI.
Yeah. So in my view, it's not, you know, go generate this blog post based on 5 words. It's take my blog post that is a really great articulation of this idea and now turn that into all the campaign assets.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Make 5 different ways of selling me the idea of reading this article, for instance.
Yeah, exactly. Or maybe we're not even reading at this point, right? Now it's create all this other content based on what's in this blog post.
Exactly.
For these audiences that we know care about this and in these contexts and channels or whatever.
And that's where I see very much sort of Gen AI, you know, play the same role. That's the AI of content. Whereas the AI of data, that would be predictive analytics and machine learning. And I see very much sort of machine learning as sort of the AI that will help sort of push data through the data pipeline faster and more efficiently. I see Gen AI helping us with that in the content pipeline.
I'm going to make a comment here that is in favor of the other part that is missing often when we talk about this, which is we talk about big data a lot. You know, and we know that larger volumes of data are as important in, you know, training LLMs or tuning LLMs as they are in good data analysis. I'm going to make a plug here for what my friend Trisha Wong, who's an anthropologist, calls thick data as well. So, you know, it's that deeper insight. It's that understanding of the people, understanding of their motivations, understanding of their behaviors that you have to constantly be layering in. And that's what no amount of quantitative data analysis and, you know, frankly, no amount of derivative creations are going to give you. And that is kind of the equivalent, I think, in the data side to human creativity. This is where people are the ones who really are the sources of those insights. We're the ones gathering that.
Right. So getting back to sort of where do we put together the content and the insights? So looking at, you know, one end on top, we have the content pipeline. I like to think of the content as being on top. And you have sort of the bottom layer, the data layer in the bottom. And then you have the pipelines through those. Where in the personalization pipeline, or where do these two data and content pipelines meet to form the personalization pipeline? How are we, I mean, within each channel? Are we before each channel? Are we before there's even thought about any channels? Or where does this happen ideally?
I think it's in all of those places. Because if you think about it, in the data pipeline, it's the combination of the data collection and analysis with what you're actually putting out and the audiences that you're bringing and what those behaviors are. That's what allows you to constantly define and refine your audience segments. You know, and I am a big proponent of meaningful differences. I would argue that one-to-one personalization outside of like, tell me something about my account is, you know, I think it's negligible. I don't think, I think there's probably diminishing returns at some point in trying to get to that, even with the power of generative AI. Because I just don't think it's gonna, there's a cutoff point beyond which it doesn't really make a difference. And we are so far from understanding where that is right now. It's a theoretical problem, but we may get a lot closer to understanding that. But what does matter is meaningful differences. And that's where I think this constant evaluation of audience segments is a really critical one. And that is absolutely an interplay of all of these things, because it's, what data do you have? Where is that derived from? It's the behavior, it's the interactions, it's what content you're putting out to which audiences, how do they engage with that? What works, what doesn't? How does that relate to, again, this idea of customer engagement, but also transactions, customer lifetime value, all this stuff really matters, right?
Yeah.
So there's some very high level analysis that I think has to be done fairly frequently. And there's so many different levels on which we can refine and adjust as well. And I think one of the interesting questions is over what time frame. And often that is a combination of events that happen, but also the time it takes to get to a significant amount of data points to be able to do some meaningful analysis.
Yeah. There's definitely a volume thing that you need to get in place as well in order for this to do anything meaningful.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is the classic problem with trying to do a lot of the B2B stuff that has been so popular in B2C for so long. It takes longer to get to those volumes.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, volume is definitely a thing. Also with content, I suppose. So if you're going to do any kind of sort of LLM repurposing of your content, any Gen AI repurposing of your content, I mean, the more you have, the better, and the more easy it is, and the less it sounds of an echo, something you already told someone.
Yeah. Well, and I think the other really crucial aspect of that is the fidelity of the outputs, right? Yeah. So I think the big race at the moment is toward tailored LLMs. And I use intentionally a vague term there because there are businesses that have been training their own LLMs from the ground up, typically for several years now. I mean, we're talking about multi-year, tens of millions of dollars investment to make that into something that's useful.
Yeah.
One of the big question marks, and I think we're very rapidly getting the proof in the industry, is whether you can use some of the other approaches like retrieval augmentation generation, like fine tuning, and there are a bunch of other methods. You can mix those together to tune, if you will, or tailor the big existing LLMs that are, receiving ridiculous amounts of investment to your content and to your priorities and business objectives.
Yeah.
And can you do that with a degree of certainty that the output is actually going to be correct? Right. And, talking to customers in areas like healthcare or financial services, this is essential. I mean, they risk violating regulatory requirements if that isn't correct.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think there's already been, examples where someone had to pay pretty big fines because they needed to sort of follow suit if the AI recommended something or suggested a specific solution for a customer. That's essentially the company promising to do that for the customer.
Well, yeah, or the classic scenario where you can get the airline bot to sell you a ticket for $1. But yeah, these kinds of things are going to get shut down pretty quickly.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, edge cases, but they're good entertainment while we are sort of waiting for it all to become perfect.
Oh yeah.
Right. Coming back to a headless CMS like Contentful. So obviously that's a lot about inbound content. So you're serving the content that people would be able to sort of consume from wherever that they are ready to consume it. And I see marketing automation platforms being much more about the outbound communication, bringing content to the people or like reactivating them, doing outbound communications and push communications. What do you typically integrate between like Contentful and marketing automation platforms? What would that be?
Everywhere we can, really. Yeah. I mean, yeah. So, all kinds of systems, certainly anything that's customer data. I already mentioned, a lot of the back-end sources like DAM, PIM, CRM, for example, ERP in some cases, but like anything, email automation, social media channels. And, this is where I think there's a tremendous opportunity.
What would you output to a marketing automation
anywhere that you want to output this stuff, right? But part of the challenge also is like, what can you bring in? So a lot of companies are using customer generated content coming from social media channels, and it's not just a question of engaging on those channels. It's about reusing and even amplifying across different channels. So like there's
generated content, definitely.
Yeah, but there's all kinds of opportunities to do that, and we are
So
always in the
reviews or
process.
how-to guides, or I mean,
Absolutely.
wherever people are talking about your product or services.
Yes. And the nice thing about the architecture and the philosophy is that we are absolutely designed to integrate.
Yeah.
And we are always building out, off the shelf integrations with a wide range of partners. We have webhooks and other abilities like an app framework that make it a lot easier to actually build any kind of custom integration that you want as well.
Yeah.
And we're kind of, my sort of analysis is like, or analogy is that it's a little bit like Tetris, like when we start to see people building some of this stuff consistently, we try to put it into the product so that people don't have to build it custom.
All right. I think we've been talking for nearly an hour now, Nicole, so I think we better sort of round off. But before I ask you the final question, last question is, so how could people learn more about Contentful, and how could they learn more about you if they would like to?
Well, the good news is both are easy to find. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm still on Twitter, come X. I'm on Threads. Contentful is easy to find. Contentful.com. You can find all kinds of stuff. One of the things that we really enjoy doing is things like this, but also a wide variety of webinars and customer conversations. And we're always open for a conversation. I certainly am.
Yeah, that's great. So last question, what's your favorite example of Gen AI, like personal favorite example?
I wish I could say that this was from my own use. It is much less from my own use than from what I have seen from a couple of my friends and close colleagues. But it's really this kind of expert, what I would call using Gen AI as an expert tool. So one of my colleagues who is a designer and a developer has been working with Gen AI to help him build out design systems and specifically to build out design tokens. And he's been doing that on one hand, and then working in Chat GPT to help create stuff based on these design systems and design tokens. And one of the things that he's been figuring out is, how much or how little information you need to input in order to get the right output. And the other is the point at which you actually don't need the generative AI anymore because you've now created the basic tool set that you can go and easily build with.
Yeah.
There's one other thing that we were on the same hackathon team for an internal hackathon that we had a couple months ago. And what was so awesome about that is that we were building on an offering that we have called Studio, which brings structured content and design systems through design tokens together to make it easy to build visually and to keep, aligned with a design system, and also to keep on message and using existing content that's structured to, for non-technical teams to go and build out, at this point, web experiences without needing developers to go and code it.
Yeah.
And we were thinking ahead. It's like, well, I'm not a designer. I can appreciate a design system, but like padding, what? I don't necessarily need to know all of the details of what's actually in the design elements. So what if I could go in and use ChatGPT as a conversational interface to, again, be my thought partner to help me create, say, long form HTML content, like a long form HTML content version of the generative AI report that we published in April as a PDF, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and that is where I start to get really excited about the possibilities here.
Yeah. I think that's a great example. Let's let that be sort of the ending remark to this episode. Thank you so much for joining me, Nicole. I genuinely enjoyed the conversation.
Oh, likewise, Rasmus. This has been fun.
And for the audience, I hope you enjoyed this conversation. So it's the Hello Firstname podcast. It's about solving the content crisis for personalization. And I'll make sure to put a link to where you can download an abstract of the book Hello Firstname. Even there should be a link to the full audiobook as a download if you better like listening to it, and any other sort of content, including the content manifesto that we spoke about briefly. So thank you very much for joining, and until next time. You've been listening to yet another episode of the Hello Firstname podcast. Remember that all models discussed in this podcast can be downloaded and are free to use. The original book, Hello Firstname, can likewise be downloaded as either the full audiobook or as a written abstract. All links are in the show notes. The podcast is brought to you by our sponsor, the omnichannel marketing automation platform, Agilic. Visit www.agilic.com for more information.